In this video, we're going to be covering how to directly find the x-intercepts of a standard form quadratic. In previous videos, we've found that you can take a standard form quadratic and convert it to intercept form by factoring, and then use the zero product property to find the x-intercepts. Or you can take a standard form quadratic and you can use complete the square to change it to vertex form, and then you can use square root to find the x-intercepts. So in this video, we're going to find out how to directly find the x-intercepts by using this formula called the quadratic formula. So in the box over here on the left side, we're going to write quadratic formula. The quadratic formula. And this formula looks like this. Our x-intercepts using the quadratic formula are going to be found with this equation, negative b plus or minus the square root of, see if I can get that square root to look a little bit better, the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then that is our numerator, and then our denominator is going to be 2 times a. So you can see, class, in this formula we've got a value, b value, c value. You know that those three coefficients are found from the standard form. So one thing we want to make sure of is, and this is the same rule that we use when we factor, you must set the equation equal to 0 before you identify a, b, and c. Let's put that down here. You must set the equation equal to 0 before identifying a, b, and c. Before identifying a, b, and c. Put the N word. So in this case, think about this, class. If we're going to find the x-intercepts, we know that y is equal to 0. We're doing the same thing that we did with factoring. You have to have the equation equal to 0 before you can use a quadratic formula. That means all of your terms need to be on one side of the equal sign, and the other side of the equal sign has to be 0, and then we can find a, b, and c. So let's go ahead and use the formula or the equation that we used in the top flap, and we'll see if we can solve the x-intercepts or find the x-intercepts by using quadratic formula. So our equation was negative 4x squared plus 4x plus 8 equals 0. In this case, all the terms are already on the left side. We already have the equation equal to 0, so we can go ahead and proceed with the quadratic formula. Our a value equals negative 4, our b value equals 4, and our c value equals 8. Now, class, here's the nice part about quadratic formula. It doesn't matter what your a value is. With factoring, we had to get a positive a value, and we tried to pull out a greatest common factor so our factoring could be a little bit easier. With complete the square, we had to get the a value to equal positive 1 in order to use complete the square effectively. But with quadratic formula, we can just leave the equation exactly the way it is. It doesn't matter what our a value is. The quadratic formula will work every time. So let's go through our steps. We're going to go through 3 steps to use quadratic formula. Step number 1. Find the discriminant. Now we're going to learn this thing called the discriminant. The discriminant is actually just the part that's inside the radical. It's b squared minus 4ac. So we're going to find, using this formula, b squared minus 4 times A times C. We're going to find that on its own first. So let's go ahead and plug in our values. Our B value is 4. That means we've got 4 squared minus 4. Our A value is negative 4, and our C value is equal to 8. Let's go ahead and put that in our calculator and see what we get. So we're going to put in parenthesis 4 parenthesis squared minus 4, and then in parenthesis here is our A value. It is negative 4 squared, and then our C value, which is 8 squared. Press equal, and we get 144. So our discriminant is 144. Now, I might teach this different than other teachers, but I like to have you do the discriminant first, and then you're going to use that in your quadratic formula. Otherwise, you're trying to put the whole formula in your calculator at one time, and if you do that, it's really easy to make a mistake when you're putting all of those things in. So we'll find the discriminant first. All right, class, step number 2. Step number 2 in our using the quadratic formula is find the x-intercepts. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually use the rest of the formula. So to find the x-intercepts, we'll actually write out the whole quadratic formula, only now we don't have to write the discriminant anymore. When we get to this part inside the radical, we're just going to put our number right here, 144. So here's our solutions, or our x-intercepts. X is equal to, let me write this a little bit lower. X is equal to, and we've got negative b plus or minus the square root of 144. Notice we're taking our discriminant from our equation, we're plugging it in the radical, and then it's going to be divided by 2a. So there's where our solutions are going to go. Now I'm going to continue this in the next column. So over in the next column, let's continue. So therefore, let's plug in our other values. X is then equal to, so we've got B value. Our B value is 4. That means in our equation, we're going to have negative, and then our B value here, which is 4, plus or minus the square root of 144 divided by 2 times a, which is negative 4. And now our final solution here to our end of our step number 2 is, let's go ahead and simplify this. This is actually then a negative 4, since the negative was part of our equation. Negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 144 divided by 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. So there are our x-intercepts. So in our last step here, all we're going to do is, for step number 3, write the final answer. Actually, we're going to say the final answers, because there are going to have 2 possibilities here. Write the final answers. So looking at our value for our x-intercepts, we can then say, okay, therefore we know that x is equal to either negative 4 plus the square root of 144 divided by negative 8, or it's negative 4 minus the square root of 144 divided by negative 8. So there are our 2 x-intercepts. Now this can be your final answer, class, right here. But if you want to simplify this, if you want to put this in your calculator and get your actual final x values or x-intercepts, let's go ahead and do this. I want to make sure you know, if you want to put this whole fraction into your calculator, let's put this in a different color so you see this. If you're going to do that, you have to make sure you put your numerator in parentheses. If you don't do that, your calculator is not going to know what is your numerator and what is your denominator. It's going to give you a wrong answer. So let's go ahead and do the final answers. Our x-intercepts are going to be equal to, let's bring the calculator up and see if we can get these. So we've got, in parentheses, -4 plus the square root of 144. Now I'm going to close the parenthesis on my square root just like you would in your calculator. Then I'm going to close the parenthesis on my numerator. So you can see, class, when you put it into your calculator, you have to close this parenthesis for your square root. If your calculator puts the first parenthesis here, you have to close that parenthesis. Then you close the numerator. And now we're going to divide by our denominator, which is -8. So there's our first answer. Let's press equal, and we've got -1. So there's our first x-intercept. Now let's go ahead and put the same equation in, only now we're going to do minus the square root of 144. So we've got parentheses, that's going to be our numerator, -4 minus the square root of 144. Close the parentheses on the square root if that's what your calculator requires. Then close the parentheses on your denominator, and then we're going to divide that by -8. Put that in our calculator, press equal, and you've got +2. So now we know that our x-intercepts are -1 and +2. And that's how we use the quadratic formula. One more thing on this. Another reason why I have you guys figure out the discriminant first is because the discriminant tells you something about how many x-intercepts there are. Let's go ahead and put this in the box down here, the discriminant. I'll put that in red. So information about this thing called the discriminant. All right, if when you do the discriminant or find the discriminant, which is just I can't get that line to be straight, hang on one second, let's try it one more time. If when you figure out the discriminant you find out the discriminant is equal to 0, class, that means you only have one real solution or one real 0. That means this parabola only touches the x-axis at one point. If you figure out the discriminant and it ends up being a positive number, so you can see our discriminant here was 144. That's a positive number. That means you're going to have two real x-intercepts or two real zeros. Remember, we can use the word 0 to describe our x-intercepts. And if the discriminant ends up being negative, so you end up with a negative number like -10 or -50, then you know immediately, class, there are no real zeros. That means this parabola never touches the x-axis. So when you're using the quadratic formula, when you get to step number 1, find the discriminant, you already know how many real solutions or real zeros you're going to have. If the discriminant was equal to 0, you're going to have actually one x-intercept or 1, 0, 1 solution. If the discriminant's positive, you'll have 2 like we have above. And if the discriminant ends up being a negative number, well, that's going to end up being the square root of a negative number when you do step 2, and that means we know that we don't have any real zeros or real x-intercepts. All right, that's the video that helps you understand how to use the quadratic formula to find the x-intercepts of a standard form quadratic.